want to chart a path forward. Best people, best conversations. We're on a journey and it's just getting started. Hey, everybody, you are back. I am Jack Murphy. This is the Jack Murphy Live podcast. And today we've got a special returning guest. We've got somebody I talked to a while back, and we had a very fascinating conversation about the differences in people, the way humans have evolved, what it means for politics. And along the way, since then, I've had a number of conversations with other people on different matters. And one issue that keeps coming up is this idea about human nature. Is it fixed? Is it evolving? Is it changing? How much has it changed materially in the last 5,000, 10,000 years? In a world where everything around us seems to be changing all the time, why is it that you can pick up a book that was written 4,000 years ago and see yourself in the pages? You can see yourself in the situations you face every day right there in the pages, and the wisdom of people like Aristotle, let's say, written all those thousands of years ago, still holds true today. And if human nature is evolving and changing, why would those things remain relevant? Here today to talk to us right now is my friend and buddy, Bo Winegard. How you doing today, my friend?
I'm great. It's this is a much more elaborate version of your show from the last iteration I was on.
That is absolutely right, man. You were a guest of mine, I think probably under number 20 episode. And I do very clearly remember recording that from a laptop in the bedroom of my
Yes.
fiance's grandparents' house. And yeah, we've come a long way with the technology and the production and the show.
Yeah.
It's a good testament to people, a good example to people for just like, get started, you guys. Like, just keep trying and just keep putting things out and just see how it works. Because if you're waiting for everything to be perfect, you're never going to get started. And if you're trying to spend a bunch of money on equipment and fancy stuff right off the bat, or spending hours trying to put together a logo for a business that hasn't sold anything just yet, you might be focusing in the wrong place. So thank you for coming back and rejoining us, man. I really appreciate it. Before we go any further, tell people where they can find you, what's your website, what's your social media, where are you driving people these days who want to learn more about you?
Shoot, I don't even know. I don't even remember my Twitter address, but I am on Twitter. You can just search my name, and then I do have
a
website.
EPO187. EPO187.
Yeah, there we go. I was in my Edgar Allan Poe phase when I introduced that. And then I do have a website, but I don't also remember much about that. But you can search me if you want to find some articles I've written or whatever.
I appreciate that. Actually, we got a guy, guys. We got a hot one. We got a guy on the show that's not driving traffic somewhere, that's not pitching a book, selling a website,
nope.
or whatever. We're just here to have a good conversation. And for the people that are watching today that didn't see the original episode, could you just give like a brief background on your education and your work experience,
Sure,
so that people understand why we're talking to you about these subjects?
Yeah, I mean, I have a long and circuitous career, I would say. But I would say the important passion of mine was evolutionary psychology. And I got into that maybe when I was like 20, 21. And then in some way, shape, or form, that has informed my thinking about the world. I'm really interested in a lot of things: history, literature, film, etc. But evolutionary psychology, or evolutionary analysis of human behavior, is sort of always in the background, at least. I eventually went to grad school at Florida State under the tutelage of Roy Baumeister. If people don't know Roy, he's a great psychologist, great thinker. He's written some excellent books. My favorite book of his is his book on evil, which is well worth reading. He's also delightfully non-politically correct, so that was helpful for me. And then after that, after I graduated with a PhD in social psychology, I got a job, which unfortunately did not last very long, at a small college in Ohio. And part of the reason I was terminated is related to my interest in human variation and my honest discussion of human variation, although I don't know exactly how much because they never told me. But there were some pseudonymous troll was sending emails to my bosses about my articles on human variation and about some of my tweets about human variation, and I was chastised several times and then eventually terminated.
Yeah.
But we don't need to dwell on that. I mean, it's out there. People can read about it.
Bo got canceled for some bull.
Yes.
And that is one of the reasons why we first started talking. We share the cancellation story, the birth of an independent intellectual free from the bondage of the university and the committees. It's been a gift to you, I am sure. I'm hoping. Let's hope for in the long run. Because who wants to work with a bunch of stuck-up idiots anyway? And we were talking before the show, actually, one of the things that got you banned was like even just engaging with tweets that you don't even agree with. You're just like, oh, that's an interesting point. Maybe we should talk about that on all sides. And that's the spirit I want to take with this conversation. Is like, let's just talk about it.
Let's just talk about it. Exactly.
Let's just talk about it. We're not coming out here to take a final position. This isn't going to be on the tombstone. This is freewheeling, open-ended discussion about stuff. And some of these things are, politically dangerous. And I think one reason is because people will take the facts that we'll discuss and run with them into some sort of conclusion that's not necessarily the only way that things can go, right?
Yeah, so, exactly.
And people would rather not talk about facts. In my experience with education, be like, why is the achievement gap? Why does that really exist? Is it because teachers suck? Is it because there's not enough money in education? Is it because people aren't trying hard enough? Oh, I don't know. Maybe there's other factors, and you talk about that, you get fired. So let's start. Let's start. Luckily, we don't have anything to get fired from, so that really does help.
That's right.
Yeah. In my ongoing exploration since we last talked, I have talked to a bunch of interesting people. I've done a Claremont Fellowship with the people from the Claremont Institute. I've studied the founding in great detail. I've studied a lot of political philosophy where I hadn't before in our prior conversation. I've also read the Bible a bunch in a way that I hadn't ever before.
I've seen some of that on Twitter.
Yeah. So I'm exploring all these things, and this question keeps coming to my mind, and this is the subject of our discussion today, is I'm reading Aristotle, right? And the virtues that he lays out, the ideas for being a good friend and a citizen and what a good city-state looks like, and just the circumstances and stories that they tell, they're all so relatable, right? It just feels relevant, pertinent, as if they're taking a peek into our current circumstances, talking about the guy that I just talked to yesterday. This is a letter from the past to the future that has transcended millennia, literally thousands of years, right? And still has resonance, whereas everything else around us is basically, completely different. It's changed. Technology has changed, transportation, communication, the nature of government, all these things have changed. But has human nature fundamentally changed? And there's a religious element that I have noticed maybe to this too, is that if everything is changing but human nature hasn't changed, well, that has some sort of implication as well. So where do you want to start this conversation? Because I want to know. I want to come away with this with the answer, Bo. Come on.
Well, I would start with two important words in that. Three actually. Human nature, 2 words, and then fundamentally. So I think fundamentally is an important adverb there. So first question, of course, is what is human nature? And I think it's important to understand that human nature is an abstraction always, because real humans are always somehow in a kind of cultural setting, right? So we might look at different cultures, and obviously you and I would both notice that even though there are some similarities, there are also differences, from things as arbitrary as they drive on different sides of the road to their marriage system. Maybe the society's polygynous, maybe it's monogamous, etc. So human nature, I think, when we talk about it, we're kind of thinking about, well, what would happen if you sort of looked at humans, separated from all of these cultural accoutrements, if you will, right? And this is sort of the way that the social contract theorists thought about it, right? They tried to strip humans from society and ask, what is sort of fundamental to human nature? I think it's important to understand that that's always an abstraction, because there's really no such thing as a human divorced from society. We are cultural creatures. We are always enculturated, as it were. But I do think it's worthwhile to think about that abstract concept, human nature. Fundamentally, I will just say, no, human nature has not changed fundamentally. That is to say, and you were pointing this out, noting about Aristotle, Plato's, I love reading Plato. So you read Plato's dialogues, it's not as if you're baffled by what he's saying, right? It's not utterly foreign to us. So in that sense, human nature has not fundamentally changed. You wouldn't read Plato and he wouldn't be, like, what is jealousy? Or, there aren't, emotions haven't completely changed in such a way that Plato talks about an emotion that we can't even understand, or Aristotle talks about a virtue that we can't understand. Aristotle wasn't arguing that murdering people was good, right? So we do have a human nature that certainly persists, and I suspect that if we went back 50 to 150,000 years, we would see a kind of human nature that we would still recognize. So it hasn't fundamentally changed. But the interesting question, the really interesting question is, has it changed subtly? And relatedly, are there subtle differences even across cultures? So if we look at Northern Europeans, are they subtly different from, say, Northeast Asians? I think that's the interesting question. And that question I would answer affirmatively, that human nature has subtly changed, and it's subtly different even if you look right now across the globe. Now, the next question is, what are the causes of those differences? And I think that's
before we get there. That's, I mean, you definitely teed it up, but like questions already came into my mind. It's like, one, if we're always enculturated, that in and of itself is a definition of human nature, right? Like we are defined by our enculturation. In that predominantly 99.9999% of us through all time and history have lived and engaged in a community, and there are there's give and take and exchange between the self and the community that form like the total existence. And so I guess,
and just to interject, you brought up Aristotle. Aristotle, I mean, depending on the translation, basically said man is a social animal. I would rephrase that in what you're saying slightly as man is a cultural animal, right?
Right. Well, it's interesting. It's an animal of community, in that we are happier, healthier, and wealthier when we cooperate positively with other people.
Absolutely.
We're emotionally better off. We are physically better off. We are materially better off when we coordinate with other people in a positive way. And then the organizational method for that community would end up being probably shared values of some kind, things that we find to be of use to each other. And I guess what I'm wondering, another question that came to mind before I even asked the question I was going to ask, is that if you strip away the surface differences of, are we in that fundamental essence, like we need to work together with people in order to be happier, healthier, and wealthier. And how do you organize yourself, but around shared values? Is that maybe not in and of itself the definition of human nature? And then everything sort of springs forth from there. And if that is the case, we're communal animals and such, then no, I guess it really hasn't fundamentally changed, in that we haven't produced like people that can thrive materially, physically, and emotionally in isolation or in outer space or under the ground, or, I don't know. I guess the cooperative nature might be like the baseline. I'm asking questions.
No, it's a really good point, and it's a really important challenge when we're thinking about human nature, because you're making this point that, like, well, maybe what human nature is to be an animal that's cultural and to need community, and then to be changed in some sense by that community, to absorb community norms. I mean, just think of what we're doing right now. We're exchanging thoughts with symbols, those, namely the English language. The English language is a product of enculturation. The fact that we can speak it is, right. I mean, if we were on a desert island, the sort of proverbial desert island dweller, we would not have a language, right? One person wouldn't create a language. So this almost the defining feature of humans. Like, I think if a Martian came down, the really weird thing about humans is they seem to exchange information with each other through symbols. That is a cultural construction, cultural creation, and then we learn it via culture. So I agree completely with that. And that's an important thing about humans, is how dependent on culture we are. However, I do think there's this worthwhile sort of philosophical, psychological abstraction. It never exists in reality, but this is sort of abstraction we can think about, like, okay, if we were to look at humans, is there something fundamentally the same, even though we look at cultures and they're variegated, they're different from each other, and Greeks do things a little bit differently from, Norwegians or something. Is there something behind that is similar that we can think about? And then is whatever's behind that, has that changed a little bit over time, or even is it a little bit different in different populations? So, for example, like tendency for effective empathy or something, or tendency toward individualism. Is that completely culturally constructed? Tendency toward even analytical thinking. And so here's just like a question to think about this, like holistic versus analytical thinking, just to give you a sense of what I'm saying here. So if I ask you, pick the things that are similar to each other out of these three, and I say bus, train, tracks, what goes together? If you're more analytical, you put bus and train together because you're like, they're both vehicles. If you're more holistically thinking, you put train and tracks together, right? Because they go together and you experience them together in the world. So some cultures think more holistically. I think if you ask Northeast Asians these kinds of questions, they tend to think a little more holistically. If you ask Western Europeans them, they tend to think more analytically. The next question, of course, is that purely cultural? Is it that there were just cultural quirks that began, say, 5,000 years ago, and we inherit the culture, and that's what causes us to think differently from each other? Or is it both that there are cultural differences, but also there might be slightly different psychological propensities in these groups for various reasons, genetic reasons, perhaps, for example? And as I think we can get into, that's sort of the forbidden fruit, as it were, of knowledge now, because there is this fervently held dogma that there are no psychological differences right now among humans that are not culturally caused. And I find that dogma preposterous. I find it incredibly implausible for a variety of reasons, which I'm happy to discuss. But that is, I think, one of the great dogmas of intellectual life, is that there are no cognitive differences that are genetically caused or partially genetically caused.
Yeah, well, way to jump up in the air and land on the third rail, my my friend. And we're going to get to that. One thing that I was struck by while you were talking is, in our last conversation, we came to a point where we discussed whether or not people would be genetically predisposed to certain types of political regimes.
Yes.
And I think that we generally agreed that is a possibility. None of
Yes.
this stuff can be stamped down with law, right? But it is a possibility. How and where and why and what are the mechanisms by which different groups of people may have evolved with different genetic makeup that would make them more analytical make them more holistic, make them more communal, make them more individualistic, make them more visually oriented, make them more empathetic, what happens? What happened? Is there something that we can go back to in history and trace why and how this separations may have occurred that would allow evolution to take place that would result in differentiation? What, if so, what was the interaction that those groups had in order to make these things become more evolutionary successful, so that they remained and persisted over time? Go with that.
No, that's an awesome, very open-ended and difficult question, which I will get to in just a second. But before that, you said, in our last conversation, we talked about were there slightly different genetic profiles that would lead to different cultural and political systems. And I think when people hear that, because of this pervasive dogma, they are nonplussed, to say the least, maybe apoplectic, right? They're either bewildered or angry, like, how dare you say that? But actually, if framed correctly, this shouldn't be a very controversial idea. And in fact, I was just thinking, I have this quote from a paper. This was a 2010 paper by, I think it was Way and Lieberman, talking about cultural differences between individualistic societies and collectivist societies. And they said, this is the quote, genes affecting brain function are likely to influence the adoption of and formation of cultural norms, and conversely, cultural norms may also shape the expression and selection of genes. Now, note the important point here, right, is that the brain is an organ like any other organ. It is it results from thousands of genes, and brains have slightly different tendencies. We know this with individuals. We know individuals are different. Some get angry faster. Some get more hurt when they get rejected or scolded. Some people are more empathetic. The next question is, well, are there group averages that are different on some of these things? So let's just take that collectivism versus individualism. We know that Western European people tend to be individualistic. They define themselves as a person separate from a group, right? And that's how they think of themselves. And if you ask them about themselves, one thing you find is that they will say, I'm a member of the Republican Party, or I'm a this, I'm a that. It's self-chosen groups to which they belong. Whereas if you ask people from collectivistic societies about themselves, it's non-chosen groups that they often refer to. I'm a member of X clan. I'm a member of this family or whatever. And there's a big difference there, because the Western European answer is very, I chose this and that's what I am. And the collectivistic Northeast Asian, let's say on average, is much more, I was born into this series of obligations and that's how I identify myself. So this shouldn't actually be that controversial. And I think it's like in the literature, if you look in the right way, you can find it. You can find people grappling with this question, like, do differences in genes across these groups explain at least slightly cultural differences? But you have to frame it very carefully to do this, right?
But the reason why this is dangerous, and I'll just go out and say it, right, is because if bye-bye YouTube, because if there's genetic differences in disposition in the way that you engage with your identity of self and your community, and the way that your values may come from the evolution of your brain, and the reasons why we're going to talk about in just a second, isolation over time, land travel, migration, etc., and thousands of years of isolated evolution could lead to a result of people having different brains that like different things, that are suited for different kind of political regimes. Well, then if you take that and combine it with Alexander Hamilton's idea that a government must be suited like a cloak to a person, a custom tailored jacket. And then you take John Jay, who says that Americans are bound by history and blood and war and religion and all these things. If you add those three things up, an answer that could come out of that is we need to screen people genetically for American citizenship.
So that's the scary answer that could come out of that. That is, I will not get into that, not because I'm afraid to, but rather because I don't have any important insights about that specific question. I think what we actually end up doing is selecting, screening for genetics via proxy. Like, so people obviously, I think countries. This is just, I don't. Uh, the political debate is a contentious one, but I would say, just in the abstract, of course, countries have the right to screen in some way, shape, or form for people they want as citizens, right? And they're going to do that in various ways. I have views that are very conservative on this issue and that set me apart from many other people, in that I think countries should. I'm an immigration restrictionist, right? So I think I would like to see the number uh, go down significantly because I care about cultural cohesion and other things. But I'm open to debate on that. But you're right, talking about John Jay, I think you're referring probably to, I think, is it Federalist number 3, in which he talks about this.
Yeah.
And yeah, you can see, like, this is important. Uh, I do think the reason this is so fraught and so contentious and divisive, even, and incendiary,
Yeah.
is because people are afraid that what you will say is, well, certain groups of people are kind of designed, as it were, for their culture, and they're going to create a kind of culture that might be slightly different from another group of people, and therefore it's perfectly legitimate for them to care about having a certain proportion of that population demographic in the country. That's a political issue. I'm surprisingly, I'm sort of like backing out of politics, in that I'm very interested in other things, and I find politics nauseating, and it doesn't fit my temperament very well, because I don't like getting in tribalistic war. I like having these kinds of conversations where we're just going back and forth. So I'm not going to get too much into the political stuff, but I think, as an empirical proposition, the claim that different human populations have slightly different genetically caused character profiles that lead to slightly different cultural systems and lead them to fit to these slightly different cultural systems is unassailable. It's absolutely the case. Now, two things. One, as I said, I think in our previous conversation, and this is like the political statement I will make about this, because I do feel strongly about this. In my ideal political system, although countries would be, a lot of countries would choose to be pretty restrictionist about immigration, if you had a personality profile that made you gravitate to one of these systems, you would somehow be able to get into that system. So, like, if I found myself, if my profile were different from, say, the average Northern European, and I felt more akin to some other group, I would hope there would be a way that I could somehow get in with that group. That's sort of my dream vision. Um, and then, did I say two things? I lost my train of thought there, but that's my political statement about it. Oh yeah, and
Yeah.
then the other question you had was, what? How did this happen? What are the causes of this, right? And that's the big question. So we have this challenge, which is, how much of this is genetic versus cultural? So I'll give you an example of this debate. Joseph Henrich, who's a brilliant anthropologist, evolutionary analyst, gene cultural evolutionary guy. He's at Harvard. He wrote a book called The Weirdest People in the World. And weird is an acronym here for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So the point is, like, how did this happen? That's what he's trying to answer in this book, is how did Europeans become so peculiar psychologically? Now, Henrich's argument is almost exclusively cultural. That is to say, he contends that the cause of European uniqueness right now is mostly cultural. I disagree with that. I think it's a combination, but that it's almost certainly somewhat genetic as well. Now, his answer then is it's cultural, and specifically, it comes from, I think, what he calls the MFP, the Marriage and Family Practice or Program of the Catholic Church. Because what he thinks is important is that the Catholic Church, banned is too strong of a word, but strongly discouraged kin marriage, cousin marriage. Now, we might think to ourselves, who cares? Like, what does that matter? Kin marriage creates kin-based groups, and we know humans are already like biased toward kin, but it turns out Europeans are less biased than a lot of other cultures. And by discouraging cousin-based marriage, what happened was you created this system that had to have rules of fairness that were universal, that were so like in a lot of cultures, you have obligations to kin and you're moral to kin groups, but maybe not to other people, or you're, because of that, you're wary to strangers, etc., and you're just much more nepotistic. Henrik argues Europeans have these universal principles and analytic mindset because of this whole slew of changes that followed from the MFP, the Marriage and Family Program of the Catholic Church. That's his argument. Other people have argued, no, if you look, you see proto-individualistic behavior and tendencies in proto-Indo-European populations even, and certainly in the Roman and Greek classical Rome, the Roman Empire, and then classical Greece a little bit before that, you see a unique individualism and analytical mindset. And it's like hard for me to believe you could look at, say, Greek philosophy going from Thales to, well, we'll just stop at Aristotle. Look at Thales to Aristotle. There is something unique about that line of thought. And I think that evinces a slightly different mental propensity or set of mental propensities from other groups, probably. But there's a lot of debate about that, and I'll tell you what, I've become softer on this. I used to be a little bit more enthusiastic about various theories, cold winners theory, for example. I'm a little more skeptical that we can know much about this. I think speculation is great, but I'll just say I have no clue. I think there are interesting ideas out there, and something happened, but I don't have a good answer about what that something was, or more likely it was a lot of somethings, right? It's not monocausal. So there are probably many different causes of this.
Right. So the answer is it's complicated. Come on. I was hoping for a little bit more, something to take to the bank here.
Well, I mean, I just think it's complicated it's the honest, humble answer. Yeah, no, I do think, I think one thing, for example, and I think we talked beforehand maybe about getting into Murray's books at some point, but like one thing that irritates me, I will say, vexes me about Henrik's book is it literally doesn't look at cognitive ability. And it's like, how can you explain group performance? In my view, trying to explain group performance and differences among populations without looking at cognitive ability is baffling. It's a baffling self-imposed handicap. But and now I don't know, I can't speak about Henrik's motivations, and I don't want to speculate about them. I do think it's clearly the case that it's such a taboo to talk about cognitive ability, even cognitive ability itself, to explain individual differences, let alone group differences, that we end up having this distorted, disfigured, really self-disfigured conversation because we can't talk about these things that almost certainly play a role. I mean, the idea that cognitive ability doesn't play a role in the way groups behave is just, it's not tenable in my view. Now, what exact role does it play? I don't know. And importantly, and I'll just make this is, unfortunately, this is a statement you have to make because people will willfully misinterpret what you're saying. Human dignity does not require human sameness. Let's just be clear about that, right? Like, my neighbor is probably not as smart as I am. I'm probably not as athletic as my neighbor, and that's fine. We're different. We're talking about differences. We're not talking about moral judgment of who's better or who's worse. That is something that I don't really like to get into because I don't think it's particularly edifying and it's not my job.
Yeah, I wonder if the lack of discussion on the Rosie's going bonkers. It's 12:30. Mailman must be here. Uh, the avoidance of the cognitive ability issue might have been his ticket into getting the book more widespread attention. You know, like had he
It may
dug
have.
down on that, that might have limited his ability to get the rest of the stuff out there.
I will
I'm
just say, I will just interject really quickly, just to be fair to Henrik. I think he's honestly somewhat of a skeptic about the explanatory power of cognitive ability. I do think that. Now, I don't know what all of his motivations are, and I don't want to speculate. He's a brilliant scientist, and he wrote a brilliant book. I disagree with some of it and agree with some of it, and that's cool.
Right, right. Isn't that great? Shouldn't we be able to
Yeah.
say and do that all the time?
One,
Too
yes,
much
one hopes,
tribalism,
one wishes.
these days.
Yeah.
I was struck by the discussion of the marriage and family practices, or however you described it, as being
Hmm.
a possibility to explain the difference in the group outcomes of the West versus other areas and other civilizations.
Hmm.
And assuming one believes that to be true, I could see why people would resist very forcefully against homosexual marriage, for example. If they would look at the marriage and family practices as described by the Catholic Church
Hmm.
and point to that as a reason by which Western civilization has evolved to the point to be, a pretty good place to be. Or we could have that conversation actually as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, yeah.
But
I'll agree with you. It's a great place to be, though. Yeah,
yeah, it is my choice of place to be.
mine as well.
That understanding the way that people mate and pair or not, or group or not, or just reproduce in general, family structure, that these things
Hmm.
have a significant impact on the culture and
Hmm.
the group outcome of your civilization. So I can see why making that first argument and then applying it to the question is whether or not we should change that structure. Why
Yes.
change that structure if it is the reason or a contributing factor? Not that there's any, I'm going to use a word I've never used before, but you said it, so I'm going to say it to sound smart. Monocausal. It's not, it's not monocausal. Of course, there's many different
Uh-huh.
reasons, but I can see why people, whether they understood the importance or the seriousness of the discussion, or whether they were just spurred onto it by people that through hate or whatever the reason may be, there might have been a legitimate evolutionary civilizational point to be made that the family structure as conceived of by the West was something that led to good things for us. And I can say, aside from, and I am well on record for saying that gay marriage being legalized was one of the reasons why I became open-minded to the Republican Party, because I felt like that issue was done and put to bed. And I was like, okay,
Hmm.
cool. I don't have hate in my heart. And so
Hmm.
I've seen the conflation though of hate and what's best for society,
Hmm.
where you may
So in other words, like, we could talk about the best policy, and even if we decided, and I'm with you, I was pro gay marriage in like the 1990s, literally. So like my my bona fides on that are fine, but we could hypothetically say, you know what, like let's take a different one because I think homosexual marriage is so it's been decided, as you noted, right? I mean, I don't think we're going back from that, and also it's if we say anything about it, it might be too contentious. So take
all
polygynous marriage instead, right?
right, yep.
Because I actually think your argument is it's more appropriately applied. Now, to be clear, I think your point is in some ways a correct one. I would maybe disagree slightly, but the point that like people in they weren't just bigots who hated people and decided let's like discriminate against them. people were trying to make, reproductive decisions of people in the community are very important. They have important consequences, not just for the individuals, but for other people too. This is the important thing. Like when you think about, we tend, and this is one of the good things about the West, so it's kind of a paradox here, but we tend to be pretty utilitarian. I'm sorry, not utilitarian, individualistic about these things, or libertarian perhaps. So we think my reproductive decisions are mine. I get to decide. And why would you care about what I do? You shouldn't care about what I do in my bedroom. But here's the thing. What people do in their bedrooms affects everybody else. It affects everybody else in a variety of ways. One thing is, and I think we actually talked about this last time a little bit, but socially enforced monogamy actually decreases male-male competition by, in some ways, redistributing sexual resources, right? I mean, I know that's a crude way to put it, but it's true, because what's happening is wealthier elites are not able to marry 5 women and thus take 4 other women out of the reproductive market, right? And so that's something where the reproductive system you have, it has important consequences for everybody in the system, and it has these consequences long down the road. Now, it is worth noting that, let's say, Gregory the First and Augustine, not St. Augustine, but Augustine, who went to Christianize on missions to England, they weren't thinking, you know what, this will have these awesome consequences 800 years from now. They didn't know that. They didn't understand that. They did think about what it would do immediately to prohibit certain forms of marriage, etc. But some of these consequences are happy accidents, if you will, right? It turns out that when you prohibit these kinds of marriages, you get different kinds of economic systems, you get different kinds of legal systems, etc. But the polygyny one, I think that's something to think about, and the way that prohibiting polygyny, it doesn't just affect sexual behavior, it affects a lot of social behavior. And just to think about minimizing male-male competition. Why is that important? Because one of the things that's incredibly difficult about creating a large society is that males will kill each other. Males compete for resources, including sexual resources, and the males who are the losers will lash out and violently interact with other males and try to take their resources. So all of these various mechanisms we have for reducing male-male competition, especially violent competition, and sort of channeling it in a productive direction, those mechanisms are really important. And one of the mechanisms is socially enforced monogamy.
Yeah. I have a lot to say, so let me get through it. The first one is when people were doing missions to convert people to Christianity, I think in their mind, they really were thinking long-term. They were thinking civilizationally. I wasn't there. I can't inject. I'm just speculating here, but like it wasn't arbitrary. It wasn't.
Well, I agree with that.
It wasn't what's the word, capricious. It was calculated, and they did want to have a positive outcome. It wasn't to make people miserable, it wasn't to hurt them. It was to say, this is the best way to form a society and a civilization, so let's enforce these norms, and let's have marriage be between one man, one woman, and each man gets one woman, and you guys have a family, and you raise your kids, and we pass on wealth, and we pass on information and culture and norms and values and everything in this way, and we don't have a giant reserved army of mateless men who are killing each other and stealing things and playing video games and jerking off to porn all day in 300 AD, right? So
yeah, I was going to say the technology was a little different from what I've read in books.
Right, exactly right. So then I'm also thinking about how the sex practices today versus people's perception of the vaccine today, for example. You will hear the same, I think, type of person making the argument that it's really important for me to have my own sexuality and to not be judged by other people and to be open relationships and maybe this or have a child over here if I want. Also, all of you better get the fucking vaccine to protect me and to protect grandma. it's very interesting that the Venn diagram overlap of sexually liberated people in this regard who are also interested in you getting the vaccine to protect me. Which I think if the Venn diagram overlap, you might have your traditionalists over here who like the monogamy and one man, one woman, who are also like the vaccine protects me. And if you want to get it, fine, I'll make my own choice. I think this is pointing out a little bit of the hypocrisy around the vaccine, or at least a misunderstanding of the mechanisms at this point. But it isn't. Go ahead.
Interjection. Couldn't you say that? I get your point. I think it's an interesting point that people have this, we've developed this hyper autonomy about sexual behavior, but then a lot of people are hypocritical and they don't have the same feeling about the vaccine. So like the vaccine autonomy argument would be, look, that's putting something into my body and I'm incredibly fastidious about what goes into my body. And then they would say, well, that affects everybody else. But they don't say the same thing about sexual behavior, even though it does affect everybody else. I think that's an interesting point. I don't have strong views about vaccine mandates. I am triple vaxxed, and I'm happy to be. But doesn't the hypocrisy also possibly go the other way? And that is to say, if you're a traditionalist and you say, you know what, like your sexual behavior affects other people, couldn't you then say also your decision to be vaxxed maybe affects other people? And that gets into a complicated debate, which I don't have strong opinions about, but I get your point, which is we have different zones of autonomy that we've carved out. And one thing you're pointing to is progressives have this very strong autonomy idea about sexual behavior that perhaps is inconsistent with reality, I think.
That's what I'm getting at. And it reminds me of the debate between liberty and licentiousness. And it also reminds me of Benjamin Franklin or whoever it was, may not even been him, but saying like your liberty extends, as far as the tip of my nose. Now, what's interesting is where is the tip of everybody's nose?
Right.
You pointed out very clearly, and I have had some change in heart about this stuff over time. I agree with your assertion that individual sexual practices have an impact on other people that aren't even your mate. It has an impact on your neighbor. It has an impact on the person in the Capitol. It has an impact on military that we have to send to go do things. I mean, it has an impact. So, and I can see why the Christian value of chastity makes good sense, because there are spillover effects from sexual behavior that aren't limited to the person you're having sex with or didn't have sex with, but random people in your same community. And one of the things that we can point to with that is in households that do not have fathers present, where the woman made a choice somehow that resulted in a single family or single mother household. The stats are very clear that there is a relationship between that and crime, relationship between that and welfare dependency, relationship between that and quality of life in the community. Excuse me. And so there was a point in my libertarian shameful past where I really believed that your independent decision making and who you chose to have sex with and how the manner in which you chose to conduct your sexual behavior didn't have a societal impact. But I do understand now that it does. And it's very clear that right now we're living in a soft polygynous society where a small group of men, the Tinder stats bear this out, the OkCupid stats bear this out, anecdotally it is borne out, and in my personal practice it is borne out, again, in my past, that there's a small group of men who are at least serially, if not concurrently, occupying multiple mating partners at the same time, to the detriment and exclusion of the vast majority of all the other men in society. And this is perhaps directly related to the breakdown in socially enforced monogamy, the advent of no-fault divorce, and all kinds of other things that have led to a decision-making that deviates from like household formation and chastity is the best way for you and for society. And I don't know how the hell we got here, but this is this is an interesting point to
We
bring
were
up.
talking about the family marriage program of the Catholic Church, and everything you've said, I agree with. It's what I wrestle with, and the sort of dialectic that I have, that I experience, that's somewhat disconcerting because I don't have it's like a dynamic. I don't have an equilibrium here. Is that I both love classical liberalism and the idea of like individualism and maximum autonomy, but also recognize the problem with that philosophy and the fact that, in fact, liberty has to be disciplined and ordered. And I don't know, I can, on one day, I feel a little more sympathetic to Catholic views. On another day, I feel a little more sympathetic to Thomas Jefferson's views. It's a dynamic tension. But I think it's important, and I wish more people would simply just, simply recognize this, that this is a real challenge and that there are externalities to any mating decision. And I do worry about, it hasn't happened yet. And I'd have to look at statistics, and we could look at them to see what exactly what's going on. But there are more people who seem to want to mainstream polygyny, at least to be able to say, I'm polygynous, I'm going to take multiple partners to this gathering, and everybody should respect that. I'm reluctant to do that. I think that's a bad idea. I think it's a bad idea for the reasons we've been talking about. And I think it inevitably will end up benefiting a subset of elite men at the expense of women and other men. And I don't, therefore I'm concerned about that. It disconcerts me.
I am concerned about that as well. I can confirm in practice, in reality, this is really happening, and it is something that needs to be on people's radar for what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years as these start to play out over time. When we start to get people in their late 30s, early 40s, early 50s who have experienced this type of mating market and have come out on the other end with no mate. It brings up so much of the things that we have discussed at Claremont and things that I've been studying about. And I'm talking to Professor Thomas West coming up later next month on what he termed the moral conditions for freedom. And this is it's shocking to me that it's shocking, but it is. I have never been introduced to these notions until the last few years. Maybe I wasn't paying attention in school. I don't know what the case may be, but nobody seemed to tell me in our general education and our general civics that our liberty has requirements. And that there need to be other things in place. It almost made it seem like a free and libertris. That's not a word. A
libertine.
No, that's going a little too far, I believe.
Okay,
if I remember, libertine being very, very sexually, just no more,
yes.
no norms, Marquis de Sade type stuff. But that there's in order to be free, you must succumb to an order. You must succumb or participate in.
I would, participate. Succumb makes it sound as though you're submitting to something and it's like bad, succumb. Like I would say participate in. Yeah. And I'm with you. I consider myself an intelligent and educated person. And it really wasn't until I was in my mid 30s that I started to think, realistically about the important cultural and moral constraints on human behavior that make freedom possible, right? I think that's the important thing. Like, I thought freedom was just the default. And of course, as you know, when you're an intelligent 20-year-old and you're listening to Rage Against the Machine and reading Thomas Jefferson, you're like, F the system, I won't do what you tell me, I'm going to be creative. And you don't think about these things. You get into your 30s and 40s and 50s, you start thinking more about civilization and how important it is and what are the constraints that allow freedom to flourish and why do we have a peculiar, and I think, awesome kind of freedom in the West? Now, again, to be clear, other people would disagree with that, and they should live in different kinds of cultures, and that's fine. I love the West, and I think you do too. I think we love the United States, and we love the ordered liberty. And it's the ordered part that I think a lot of people have lost sight of. And like, what is that order? What allows us to have this? And that's really important to me. And thinking about it, I'm with you. It's something that I don't think is emphasized, because I think we're so obsessed with racial justice and all of these things that they teach you. And actually, I don't want to just sit here lamenting this, but a lot of the education is just how horrible the West is. And the idea that we could take pride in this, and which I do, I take great pride in being a member of the West and participating in my own little way. That's considered like outre at best, and kind of like boorish, and sort of almost despicable now to say I'm prideful of being European and participating in a European culture. Now, that said, I'm sure somebody who's Chinese is proud of being Chinese and participating in Chinese culture, and that's fine too. That's the thing. Like, I think people need to understand, when I say I'm proud of that, it doesn't mean I think other groups are inferior. It just means I like this, and I like to be around people who like it and enjoy participating in it.
Yeah, and I think that you're touching on there part of Alexander Dugin's fourth political theory, which acknowledges the value of the civilizations that form around people that have different ideas of self, that the civilizations that evolve around those people's different ideas of self as it relates to their geography. He makes a very clear distinction between land-based people and sea-based people, and I can see how that applies. I can see how where your people's evolved over time, would the geography has important factor. And so he believes, and he's post-liberal. I'm not even sure exactly what that means these days, but I've been hanging out with a bunch of people. I've been hanging out with a bunch of people that say they're post-liberal, and just going to their conferences and listening. And I'm talking to Dugin. I'm talking to Dugin again in a couple of weeks. He has a new book out, Great Awakening versus the Great Reset. And he will say, I believe, that we have to respect the civilizations that evolve out of the differences of self-perception and geography and their communities to exist in a multipolar state. Vox Day, totally shunned off of social media. I'll probably get banned for even just saying his name. He has put forth a position of omni-nationalism. And I think the point here is that nationalism is okay. Being proud of who you are is okay. Being proud of your society is okay. And saying that this is the best one for me, this is the key distinction, right? Is that America has had interjected into its discourse and its perception of self that we are universalistic. Universalistic, is this a word? And that our idea of government is like the best thing, the only thing, and everybody should adopt it. And if you don't adopt it, you're a heathen. And so it's interesting to me that people might take on a multipolar perspective, appreciating for genetic differences, difference of perception of self. I'm trying to dance around the Heideggerian concept here, the Dasein, which I don't know really too much about.
We need no Heidegger in this.
Right. As if we need anything to take us off the cliff into Cancel Town any sooner than that. But that America has to become proud, like at once prouder of itself, while also acknowledging the value and existence of other peoples, and then fitting itself into that puzzle piece, instead of just being like, our way is the best way and you must submit, which is what our foreign policy has been. And it is what the progressive strain of thought is, starting with Wilson and all the way through to today.
Yeah, you put that puzzle quite apropos the way you put that. So let's think about that and unpack it, because I like that point. So on the one hand, both you and I think, would say we should in fact be more proud of the West and of America than people are in mainstream discourse. But on the other hand, more humble about the appropriateness of exporting liberalism to other societies. And you think about the um, G.W. Bush, let's just take that foreign policy view. One of the issues, I think, was it's not that George W. Bush and the people around him were evil people or wanted to conquer the world. The reason their foreign policy was so disastrous was precisely because they had this belief that freedom and liberalism were default positions, and all that you had to do is obliterate the obstacles to it, and it would arise again just naturally. It would, it's almost like a weed that will just come up if you just get rid of the obstacles. I look at it as a fragile flower that requires significant tending and a history of the appropriate cultural norms and institutions and ideas. And so the idea that you could just export liberalism to Iraq or to Afghanistan or to some country and say, we're going to liberalize you and you'll thank us for it, is disastrous. It's a calamity. And so that's exactly right. What you're saying is, like, on the one hand, admiring and being proud of your civilization, but on the other hand, recognizing that there are other peoples who belong to different kinds of civilizations, and they're proud of theirs, and they don't want liberalism, or maybe their traits are just slightly different. They don't want the kinds of institutions we have, and that's also okay. And you're right, it's really weird because you get this attitude from progressives both that you shouldn't be proud of the West. In fact, they think like the only thing unique about the West is that it's uniquely iniquitous. It's this wicked civilization. But on the other hand, they also think if you say other countries can't be liberal, you're a racist, right? Like that somehow reflects your own. And in fact, G.W. Bush, I forget what the book was, but he said like one of his influences was this book that made precisely this argument that the view that Iraq can't be democratic in the next, say, 30 years is racist, because of course they can. Like, who are you to say these people, just because they're a different skin color, can't do this? And it's like, that's not what we're saying. And it's this weird, it's kind of a contradictory worldview, isn't it? That on the one hand, the West is just evil, but on the other hand, of course, every society should be like the West and should be liberal. And if you say that they shouldn't be liberal, or maybe they can't be liberal, they don't want to be liberal, you're the racist.
It's baffling, the contradictions that come out if you just keep talking and asking them questions. And I think that's why it appears to be chaotic. It appears to be all over the place, dangerous, because it's not rooted in a fundamental first principle that can be extrapolated logically through other discussions and other areas of thought. And we're going to come to a point soon, I think, where we really need to grapple with the idea of American universalism and just walk that back. And I think that we can walk that back while still being proud of ourselves. And I think that it's tied to it's almost actually withdrawing the assertion of universalism and the fact and this assertion that American way of life could be for everyone. I think walking that back is actually a testament to its power and uniqueness, and therefore its value, right? If something is applicable to everyone, then maybe it's not very valuable. If everybody has the same thing, it's not very valuable. We've got our own thing. It's valuable, and it applies to us. And it applies to us for a number of reasons.
Right.
Historical, genetic, cultural, language, all these things.
See, people really, if you read, and it's been a long time since I've read the Federalist Papers, but I remember when I read Federalist, I think, again, it's John Jay's, and he talks about Americans, being a people who are united by all of these things. When I first read that, it was incredibly jarring to me because we're simply not taught to think that way. We're taught to think in completely deracinated universalist terms. And the idea that, like, what Jay's saying is the reason we can be great and this can succeed is actually because we are a people who share all of these unique things, and therefore that will allow us to create this thriving republic. I think now I take that very seriously, and I think it's an important insight, and it's what has been lost in this universalistic thinking, and this idea that it's somehow, derogatory to other peoples if you think there's something unique about your civilization and the people there, right? Immediately critics go to, oh, that's all right, alt-right, blood and soil. So like Rich Lowry wrote a book on nationalism, and it's a good book. It's a good read. I have some quibbles with it, but I thought it was an excellent, morally laudable book. The reviews of it were absolutely hysterical. I mean, just the idea to these cosmopolitan elites that you would argue in favor of a kind of nationalism, it was just, they abhor that idea. And it's really puzzling to me how there's this disconnect between the sort of, I don't like to make these simplistic sort of divisions, but let's just say like there is an educated kind of anywhere cosmopolitan elite, and they find these kinds of ideas appalling, and they ridicule them. But not only do they ridicule them, they also ridicule the people who espouse them. And that creates this kind of bitterness that's, to me, totally understandable from people who love the country and they love the West, and they don't understand why they're being ridiculed just for having pride in their own culture. Right? It's
Right.
such a baffling thing that you would ridicule a person for expressing pride in his or her own culture.
This is going to be the political dividing line that's moving through both of the parties.
Yes.
Should you be proud to be an American and all that it stands? That, and
Yes.
for all that it stands, that is the dividing line that's making its way through. And right now it's making its way through suburban white housewives who are coming to terms with the fact that the schools have been taken over by 1619 CRT folks that are teaching little Sally that she's a racist and an oppressor and that American history is shameful. And then they come home and they tell their parents that, and their parents are like, what the hell? That's not true. And so that line is slicing through the dinner
Right,
table
and I think just
right
to,
now.
I'm going to get political. Well, we've been political, but I'm not going to explicitly political here with the CRT stuff. I don't care what we call it. It is absolutely true that the educational system in the United States teaches that the United States has just this wicked history of racism, and which some of that is true, but like there's a difference between teaching that that was a failure of people to achieve their ideals, and that in fact what was unique about Europeans is that they recognized that these were morally appalling practices and ended up abolishing them at great cost to themselves, right? That's one way of teaching it that would jive with the actual historical record. The way it's taught a lot now is basically the US is uniquely evil, the West is uniquely evil. I think I've talked to other people about this. It's this kind of paradoxical Western exceptionalism in which the West is exceptional because it's pure evil, as if other peoples haven't conquered each other, as if when you looked at like the United States, well, let's not call it the United States, North America before the Europeans got here, as if it were this land of peace and prosperity and no ownership and hippie love, kind of like quasi-indigenous people hippie love. It's baffling to me. And it is like when I talk to even uh, normal liberals, I mean, that is Democratic voters who are not intellectuals, they are appalled by this kind of teaching and by what frankly is, and I will say this, and we'll get more controversial every couple of minutes, I guess,
Do it.
what is frankly anti-white racism. It's frankly anti-white, anti-male sentiments. And I know people who have white sons, right? White kids, male, who happen to be male, they're appalled by this, right? And yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, again, like, are there things to criticize in our history? Of course. Have white men done bad things? Yeah, so has everybody. Let's have an open talk about this. Let's debate it. Let's not call each other racist. Let's not promulgate anti-white racism. And I think let's be proud of our real accomplishments here.
Yeah,
It's
indeed.
spectacular.
It makes me, I'm pretty sure this is a foreign mind virus injected into the system decades ago that is now just propagated itself throughout our institutions. It is a self-destructive path, right?
It
Like
is, yeah.
if this was something occurring in nature and we fast forward it, you would see that this little ecosystem would die. The ecosystem will die if you go down the path and follow the internal logic of the system that people are trying to inject. It will die, which is why when people raise the alarm on Western civilization being at risk, they're not being hyperbolic.
I know, and I hate that. I hate it that they're not, because then I pride myself on being like a rational moderate, but I'm very alarmed about these things. And when I say, no, this really is just anti-white racism, a lot of this is. It's explicitly anti-white racism. People say you're being histrionic and hyperbolic just like the other side. And it's like, but no.
But no.
Like,
it's
Kendi
in the literature.
Argues, right? I mean, Kendi explicitly argues that discrimination today against whites is justified as a way of rectifying this evil past. And if you think about, like, just take the smallest one that everybody seems to accept, but is absolutely baffling to me. It's just like affirmative action is just anti-white racism. Like, quite literally, that is what it is. And if you think that it's a justified policy, okay, we can have a debate about that, but let's be honest about what it's doing. It is actively discriminating against white people. That is what it's doing, period. Also, I mean, this spreads out into culture in so many ways, and it creates, I mean, it's not surprising, right, that white men are fleeing to the Republican Party. I mean, you can look, each election you just get like a little bit more going to the Republican Party, and it's not surprising, because if you're in the Democratic Party now, like, let's say Pete Buttigieg tries to run in 2024. Let's say Biden, something happens to Biden, who knows what. He will have to answer this question over and over again. Well, why should a white male run? Why are you, as somebody who says you love diversity and preach the gospel of diversity, why are you as a white male running? It's like he'll have to apologize for being a white male and consistently answer that question, for which, frankly, there isn't a good answer from the viewpoint that he promulgates himself, right?
No, his answer to that is that he engages in homosexual behavior. That makes him qualified.
I guess his answer would that's his sexual diversity, right? That he somehow contributes to. And
the absurdity of that is something that we need to just give a pregnant pause on. How absurd is it that a presidential candidate legitimately is going to say that the reason why it's okay for me to run for president is because I engage in homosexual practices?
That is this diversity that, yes. And again, like, I am very pro-gay rights, pro-gay marriage myself. Okay, but yes, like, how does that in any way qualify? I mean, to me, sexuality is irrelevant. I don't care. I don't care at all what the potential presidential candidate does sexually. Now, do I care about norms of monogamy, as we were talking about? Yeah. So let me even qualify that statement. I don't care what the president does if he's a monogamous person in a monogamous relationship, right? No, I do care about, I used to not care about what Bill Clinton did, let's say. Now I think I do, because I think it sets a bad example. I think it's good to be judicious and prudent as an elite male when you could otherwise engage in a lot of sexual behavior. But my point is, if you're monogamous, I don't care. But it doesn't qualify you. It's not a unique qualification.
It's not a qualifier. Exactly.
Neither is being a woman. Neither is being an African American. Neither is being a white, by the way. It shouldn't matter. But
you're a white.
People make it matter.
Yeah, go for it. And then I want to come back to this. Yeah.
Absolutely. So one thing that, one thing that I really care about all of this and this pernicious ideology is that it makes thinking scientifically about humans, which is what I like to do, philosophically, scientifically, impossible, because you can't talk about obvious things such as differences among human populations. It's treated as ipso facto racist, and you are chastised. And so these just obvious things that we should be able to talk about. And as we talked about before, and maybe we'll get into this, like people who have the courage to do so, such as Charles Murray or Stephen Saylor, are ridiculed, assailed endlessly, and cast out of polite society. That's what is so, like, I find so appalling about this, because I'm about free speech, free debate, free discipline debate, I will say, because there are complications there. But anyway, and this is really encroaching on that.
It really is, but I think it all goes back to where is this discussion going to lead? And it's these people taking the leap of talking about reality is going to lead to a political outcome that they don't like. And so they have to clamp down on the discussion and therefore stymie a discussion and investigation. This is why the progressives are not the party of science, because they're unwilling to look at actual science.
Absolutely. Look, like, let's take just one example, because this drives me crazy. I actually read this book by Lee McIntyre. It was called How to Talk to a Science Denier. And now he tried to be pretty congenial in it, but it was clear that he had this incredible bias. So he doesn't even talk about all of these obvious forms of science denialism that progressives, not only that they engage in, but that they applaud and espouse. So systemic racism. We can't even talk about the actual, like, empirical claims. It's just this religious dogma that you have to accept and capitulate to, and it leads to all kinds of science denialism. For example, and this is not disputed, anybody listening to this now, nobody disputes that there's an IQ difference between populations inside the United States right now. Nobody who knows the literature disputes that. You can't even talk about that when you talk about, as you talked about, the educational gap or pay gaps, right? Wealth gaps. You can't even talk about something that is a undisputed fact in the literature that would be relevant. Take a different one. When we talk about the criminal justice system, is the criminal justice system racist? How many people talk about the massive disparity in crime rates between these groups? That's an undisputed fact. There's debate about how large the disparity is, but it's there and it's undisputed, and yet progressives will not allow you even to talk about that.
Right.
That's science denialism.
Wow, you mentioned a couple of names. We're definitely getting banned. Charles Murray, Stephen Saylor. Holy smokes, y'all. Don't go out there and search for their names on Twitter. And you certainly shouldn't follow either one of those guys. I don't recommend that at all. It's funny, if you retweet one of those two or you hit a like button on one of them, you're definitely dangling your foot into the fire.
That's right.
It is, because that's what they do. They make the price of association too painful, and they're trying to shun and ostracize people and make it so that if you even just talk to a dude, you get fired. And that is whack. But let's continue the conversation, because very fascinating stuff coming up here. And so what do you think we do? And this was a problem that I faced in discussions, private discussions with some known figures on the right, where let me back up a second. Inside the Liminal Order, my all men's organization, we have fitness standards. And our policy around the fitness standards is set the standard, live the standard, praise those that achieve the standard, and support those who work towards it. Mm-hmm. And we've had debate around whether or not we should actively shun or shame people that don't meet or even work towards the standards. Now, if you just have no interest whatsoever in achieving the standards, then you can't come in. We kick you out for sure. But there's a debate around how much negative reinforcement do we apply to achieve the positive group outcome we wish to have? And I
Mm-hmm.
think that this is a translatable discussion into, for example, culturally enforced monogamy.
Mm-hmm.
How do we promote something like that? Do we set the standard, live the standard, praise those that live the standard, and help those that wish to achieve it? Is there more to it? Do we have to actively shun those that elect to not participate in that standard?
Yeah,
What
that's
what role is there for negative reinforcement, for exclusion, and for shame
mm-hmm.
when trying to achieve a socially enforced norm that has a positive group outcome?
Right. That is something with which I wrestle endlessly because so let's just take the concept of body shaming. I think this is a good one just to think about this. So it's undoubtedly the case. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming that obesity is incredibly unhealthy. It's unhealthy in every way. I mean, just take COVID, for example. Clearly, body mass index is related to negative COVID outcomes. We almost never talk about that as a society anymore. And in fact, we have the term body shaming. If you criticize somebody who is grossly obese, it's seen as uncouth at best, right? It's mean, whatever. I wrestle with this because as an individual, I don't like to shame people very much. I don't like to criticize people for being obese, and I do empathize with people. But on the other hand, I think, look, like obesity is about eating more calories than you should. Pretty much straightforward, right? Now, I mean, obviously, exercise, you can burn a little bit, but really it's about eating too much. It just is. It's about self control. And if shame is a way to cause people to be disciplined, then it can be a positive force. And I think one of the really important things that humans need is discipline. The discipline that ideally the discipline would be sort of internalized discipline. Like I have this ideal, I read these people who encourage me, and I decide I'm going to hike 30 miles at the end of 5 months. And I work really hard to do that. That's a kind of internalized discipline. But there's also an external discipline that comes from the fear of shame or social disapproval, social disapprobation. I think that can be effective. And to me, it's just an empirical question, but I think we've gone way too far the other way to the point that we actively lie about things. We pretend that obesity is not bad because we don't want to quote unquote body shame. Um, but interestingly, we smoking shame. So think about how quickly it became uh not just boorish, but almost like wicked to be a smoker. Like I've lived through this and I quit and I'm happy that I did. But I got to the point where I was smoking when you had to huddle in the corner on the side of the street because they wouldn't let you smoke anywhere. And basically people would just criticize and ridicule smokers. I think that probably is a good thing. It probably led to a lot of people quitting smoking, and smoking was really bad. Similarly, obesity is really bad. Now, here's the problem. Another problem, though, which is it's hard to know for any individual how much of their obesity is like, do they have some sort of body, is there some sort of glandular issues, et cetera, et cetera. And I would find it appalling to walk up to somebody and just say something mean about his or her body. On the other hand, in general, I think we should promote healthy bodies and we should promote working really hard and sacrificing and disciplining. And this goes to monogamy too, as you say. Look, monogamy can be, it's a sacrifice for, especially for men who have viable alternatives. And I think we should work hard toward creating norms that praise men who make those sacrifices. And I can tell you, this is like an odd thing, but just I have, I I find men who made the sacrifice appealing and laudable. So like Paul McCartney. He was married to Linda McCartney for a long time, and he was Paul effing McCartney. He could have had anybody, 10 women at a time, and he chose to pursue this. Maybe he cheated here or there. I don't know about that, but he was basically monogamous. Same thing with another person, the coolest male in the world, Paul Newman. He had a monogamous marriage with Joanne Woodward for a long, long time. And even his unauthorized biography, I think it accuses him of one affair. This is Paul Newman, the Greek god of men. I find that very appealing, and I think that's something we should encourage. And if shame plays a role in that, I would promote it. Now, I'm an empiricist, so I would say, like, what's the evidence? Like, how much does shame work? What are the trade-offs? Because there are trade-offs. Obviously, having someone come up to you and say, oh, you're hideous or you're fat or something is very unpleasant, and I don't find that appealing. So it's just, we have to weigh all of this. But I do think shame can play a positive role in contributing to people being disciplined humans, which is what we ultimately want and what you want, right? I think what culture can do, what civilization can do, is try to promote discipline positively, make you want to be a disciplined person. I'll give you a different example, like high culture, something I'm interested in, like high poetry, T.S. Eliot, etc. Like, it's really hard to read a T.S. Eliot poem at first. I remember reading The Wasteland when I was like 18 and being like, what the fuck is this? Like, huh?
Yeah.
And I had to work really hard to get to the point where I felt as though I understood what Eliot was trying to do. I'm really glad that I did, because it gives me a kind of pleasure now that I worked really hard. I read a lot to understand this complicated poetry. And what I found was it was the idea of being the kind of person who liked this kind of poetry that gave me the motivation to do this, to discipline myself, to read 12 hours a day. Paul Bloom has a book called The Sweet Spot, where he talks about the importance of some kind of suffering to human meaning and happiness. And I think that's really important. And I've thought a lot about that recently after reading his book and listening to interviews with him, and just thinking about how important it is to sacrifice for something and how much more meaningful it is when you sacrifice for it.
Indeed. How do we promote and praise and idolize sacrifice for the greater good, but that fits into our individualistic perspective in the West? That's not a collective endeavor. And I think that the difference there is like whether or not the state is going to be involved. I have evolved to understand that the founders did not want a state religion, mostly because they didn't want the state mucking around with their religion, not because they didn't want the religion mucking around with the state. It wasn't to keep religion out of government as much as it was to keep the government out of religion, because they understood and said explicitly over and over and over and over and over again that in order to have the republic that they designed, you had to have a moral and virtuous people. And those morals and those virtues needed to be reinforced over and over and over and over again. And they talked very clearly and explicitly about government-run schools whose goal was to promote a love of republicanism and a patriotism, and Lincoln called it a political religion. And the role of the government in schools was to promote love for the country and for Republican form of government, and to teach the morals and the virtues required of the people that were required by the design of the regime of the government that they put forth and ratified. Now, we have totally lost perspective on one of those elements, which is that the moral and virtuous people are required for this Republican form of government. But the other side, the progressives, the crazy anti-white racists, they have not forgotten the part about how important schools are in shaping people's perception of themselves and the government and the regime in which they live. And so Republicans, conservatives, I don't know if that's even the right word anymore, have to retake with vigor the schools, the promotion of moral and virtue, the promotion of acting with society in mind when you make your individual decisions, as perhaps ironic as that may sound or contradictory as that may sound, because you will not have freedom as you wish to understand it. You will not have liberty without making these sacrifices and putting yourself on a moral and virtuous path. Now, I'll admit that I did not understand this until just a few years ago, and more importantly, even just punctuated with reading the original texts, reading state constitutions at the time of the revolution, reading the letters, reading the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, reading all these contemporary texts beyond the Constitution and the Declaration, which give context to the greater and broader conversation. I didn't understand all that. And it's plainly in the text that I see. And I can see how losing control of the schools, the progressives capturing the schools, promoting an anti-American sentiment. I can understand the founders foresaw this. They saw this as a problem. They saw it potentially coming, and that's why they wanted to teach people to be moral and virtuous so we could have a Republican form of government. And when you combine this with our earlier discussion about people being genetically perhaps predisposed to certain types of political regimes, it really puts so many of these conversations that we're having into perspective. And I can understand why the other side would want to shut down discussion on these matters and promote things like fat acceptance, because fat acceptance is the degradation of our values, and promoting and praising people that do not adhere to a nuclear form of the family, monogamous, family-based, even, dare I say, man-led, relationship with the head of the household, all these things, that they not only denigrate that, they do, but they promote these alternative lifestyles as a political point, as a way to actually sow discontent and a way to disrupt the form of our government. And the way that I say this now, my old self, I think, man, what is he, like 85 years old? Is he smacking a Bible on the table? What an uptight weirdo loser this guy has become. But man, there's more to life than just figuring out what makes you happy in that moment and seeking that out. And we've lost that. And especially if you tell people that American government is corrupt and useless and terrible and evil, then why would anybody make any sacrifices for it? Why would you commit yourself to monogamy? Why would you not run around and have 1,000 kids with 1,000 people if you didn't care that the government and the regime were a good one and that we should promote and protect it?
I would refer that more specifically to the culture and the civilization more than the government per se, or the regime, if you will. I would just say, like, what I care about is the culture and the civilization. I agree with you. I'm going to soften your view just slightly. So what I'll say is, I know I'm friends with many people who are progressives who are not anti-white racists. I think there's a subset of them who promulgate that, but actually a lot of the progressives I know don't like that. They find that distasteful. They're more interested in what they consider economic justice. Maybe I disagree with them, and that's okay, but they are not promoting Kendiism, as it were. I would also say, like, I do think, just to your point about the obesity, I think it's fair to be fair to another perspective on this, and I think it's something we should debate. There are trade-offs, and I do understand. I'm kind of a softie inside, and so, like, I don't like judging and shame. It makes me feel bad, and I know that's just soft. Like, I do think some of me has to overcome that, because it really is the case that sometimes it's better. I mean, I try to think about, like, what would you want for your kids? And, like, with your kids, you would say, look, you have to be disciplined. I would. And, but it's hard because, like, I just think about all of these shows, and maybe, do you remember, have you seen Little Miss Sunshine?
Long time ago.
I don't know why this popped in my head, but it is germane, I promise. So there's a scene in which the father is, he sort of scolds his daughter for wanting more ice cream. and it's depicted as, look at, why would this guy do this? Like, this guy's taking himself too seriously. He's ruining his daughter's enjoyment of her dessert. But like, the dad's not wrong. Right? And so it's weird because we have this culture in which that's always depicted as bad in the movie. The person who's like, you should discipline yourself, maybe don't eat as many cookies or whatever. And I can sympathize with that. I relate to that. I'm like, yeah, like the dad who just says, go for it, be who you are. It's like positive and it gives me warm feelings, but sometimes that's not the right thing. And we do have to promote discipline.
I wonder, I would just want to interject on this one thing. I wonder if we're being naive, bro. I feel like there's a part of me that says that we are just, as somebody once told me, you're a tadpole, the frog will come, just give it time. What happens if we are in that process here still, where we understand that there's things we need to promote, there's values and virtues and morals we need to promote, there's standards of living and way of life that are good for you and good for everybody, and they may be hard and they may seem like rules and they may suck, but it actually leads to better outcomes for you personally and for the world. Maybe we're being naive that you can only promote the good, live the good, praise the good without seriously scolding and punishing the bad.
I think we are. I admit that I am, and that it causes me pain, but it makes me think about maybe this is like a little personal tale, but my wife and I have a very different attitude about the dog. I discipline the dog. I will scold him very vigorously. I don't give him many treats. And my wife is, very, I call her a sellout. She's always giving him treats, etc., etc. And like, it does reflect this different attitude, because I'm like, no, the dog is better if he's disciplined, and if he doesn't have these treats, it's not actually good for him to indulge him. So I do recognize that you have to. I mean, look, punishment is effective, and the threat of punishment is very effective. And one reason I don't do a lot of stuff is because I'm worried about punishment. We all are. And in fact, I write reviews on time because I don't want to disappoint people and I don't want them to scold me. And I've been scolded by professors and mentors, and I didn't like it at the time, but I'll tell you, there were a couple cases in which I got a severe scolding from a professor, and I was upset, and I went home, and at the time maybe I was smoking cigarettes, so I smoked a lot of cigarettes, and then I was like, no, that's exactly right. I needed to hear that. I was effing up here, and I need to commit myself. And I know in a couple of cases, it really helped me, and it was exactly the right thing to do. And I think about it now, and I think the person who scolded me really cared about me. And that's why he or she scolded me, is precisely because she knew I had talent and that I could do something, and that it would be more unpleasant to scold me, but better for me in the long run.
Believe me, this hurts me more than it hurts you.
Right. Right. That, yeah, it's a sort of famous sign slogan or whatever, but it's really true in many cases. And I do think, I hate to sound like some sort of conservative cliche here, but there is probably a bit of softness about our society that's not altogether applause worthy, right? And that maybe a little bit more focus on discipline, hardship, and sacrifice would be good.
It would be. And I only have about 5 or 7 minutes left, so I want to bring this in.
Went quickly, didn't it?
Dude, almost 2 hours. Yeah. Wow. I want to put this into just one last question discussion area here.
Great.
Who is to be the disciplinarian? We had guardrails, we had bumpers, we had institutions that provided this discipline, that gave people an orientation to work towards, a set of standards and ideals, a holistic worldview, in some cases starting with a supreme being that made you in his image, that wants you to be healed and wants to help you and save you. You just got to do these certain things and everything will be okay. And we've lost that largely in the United States. there is a lot of shame even around that. Like societally, if you're a religious person, I think good half of the country thinks that you're an idiot. And we've lost, I think, the relevance of the religious sort of vehicle for guiding people towards these positive group outcomes. And the schools aren't teaching it, and the media is telling everybody it's okay to be fat, and nuclear family is stupid. Black Lives Matter specifically wants to disrupt the nuclear family. So who is going to be, and what is the most appropriate source of the discipline that you're providing for your dog? But I would have argued that actually, and let's not rehash this, but I would argue that that is the perfect union of male and female energy, the disciplinarian and the lover, that together.
I think that's right.
But who in our society right now, what institution, what do we do? Who's the one to set the standards and push them and enforce them? Do we enforce?
It's such a terrific question. And I will say, remember at the start when I said it's complicated and you were disappointed? I'm going to say that again, but I will try to hazard some answers and just point out this is one reason that I haven't paid as much attention to politics. Is something that I've realized is that my temperament is not designed for politics. I like to think about these things and I like to wax philosophical and have this kind of a conversation, but I don't like to participate in the rough and tumble because I don't have, I'm not certain about almost anything. So I end up questioning myself and thinking, is this the right thing to do? I don't know. I'm personally secular. I'm an atheist, but I revere Christianity, but sometimes I get angry about certain parts of it. I don't know. I'm this bundle of contradictions. And I think my comparative advantage is an area, a discipline that allows me to explore those, like philosophy or something, right? Where these contradictions are advantageous, I think, and my openness to ideas. In politics, you have to commit to something, and that's okay. But you have to commit to something and work toward that goal. And I'll give you an example, like the way Chris Rufo does, for example, or you do much more effectively than I do. And I think it's a difference in temperament. So I see Chris Rufo and he works on this CRT stuff in the schools and he is committed to this and he works hard. And you work hard for the values you care about. I just don't quite have that. So I just say, I'm a little more, I don't know. I don't want to make it sound that my traits are better because I don't mean that. I honestly mean I just don't have that kind of.
I wasn't taking it that way.
Okay, good. I don't have that kind of tenaciousness or something. So I don't know, but I do think that what I would like is important to me is that we have these values promoted by something that's not the government. Because one of the things I love about liberalism, and I am not a post-liberal, so I'd love to debate a post-liberal sometime. I'm personally somebody who loves a disciplined, ordered liberalism. I want our culture to teach these values, not the government, right? So I want it to be something that is absorbed by the young, that we inculcate, and that we somehow promote these values through what, say, Yuval Levin calls intermediary institutions, right? And this is what the church used to do. The church, the boys club, whatever it was, these kinds of institutions that people participated in that did discipline them and gave them a sense of direction. And importantly, when these institutions discipline you, you understand that it's coming from a place of love and respect for you. And that's why I think it has to be an institution that's closer to the ground, closer to your community, right? This is one reason I think community-oriented politics are important. I wish people would care more about their community and like what's working in my community, what's not. Let's create the institutions we need in my community and instill these values in my community, because we get lost in, and I'm not even saying it's bad because some of these national issues are really important, but also sometimes they can be a distraction. So what some idiot progressive said in Seattle is a distraction from my community and something that I could be doing to help people right here in my community, whether that be by belonging to the church or the club or working at even a farm exchange or something where we can teach kids, like, here's how you sacrifice for a goal. Here's something you can work toward. Those are the things that I think are important. Ben Sass writes eloquently about them. I tend to like that point of view, and I feel as though I'm losing the political debate, and I don't see much of that represented anymore. And that's another reason I've kind of checked out a little bit of contemporary politics. But that would be my idea, my ideal. And I see that you've got more into Christianity. I've seen you quoting the Bible and talking about your own experience there. I think, although again, I'm personally an atheist, I think if those values, I do love those values, and I think they contribute a lot to community life. And I know in my community, a lot of the people are very religious, and it's a nice community, and I really like that. And that's one of the things I think the challenge of liberalism is not to get too individualistic, right? And that's the tension.
Indeed.
So that would be my answer. I don't know what your answer might be better.
Full of tension, and
tension. Yes.
That's where the good conversations are anyway. Where the tensions are, for sure. I believe that the Liminal Order is that intermediary institution where we are promulgating the values that we believe are important to society. I'm very excited to see guys like Josh Hawley and J.D. Vance start talking about masculinity, the attack on masculinity, in a political forum, because I think it's crucial. I believe enhancing, rebuilding masculinity and masculine virtues is perhaps the cultural project of our time. And I'm proud to say that we've been at it now for many years, but the Liminal Order has been in official existence since June of 2019. And we work to promote, enhance, and manifest and embody the values that we think are important to not only living a healthy and virtuous life for ourselves, but for our families, for our community, and for our nation. It's pretty exciting to be able to do something that helps yourself, which you know can help society, and fight this battle that's ongoing all the time, all around us, on all fronts. Bo, I gotta go. I could go for a little bit longer, but I got other things I gotta do. I gotta go pick up my kids.
Totally understand.
Yeah, but I really appreciate the time and energy. It was a great conversation. You and I could riff forever. Yes. I know you've said before, and we're not going to talk about it now. I know you've said before that maybe we don't agree on a lot of things. I didn't find anything that we really disagreed on, so that's an interesting thing to consider. And I just think that it was a lot of fun, and I appreciate your wide range of knowledge and the things that you're willing to discuss. It's important. It's powerful. I think that we can set an example for people by being bold to talk about things which are spicy. Yes. That ultimately have the best outcomes for everyone at heart. So, Bo, thank you very much. I'm going to wrap this up.
Much.
I will follow up with you afterwards. Thanks so much for coming on. Guys, it's Bo Winegard. He's not much on Twitter anymore, but you can find him there at EPO187. Also, Google his name here, learn his story. He got canceled like a bunch of us, and I appreciate his time and energy. All right, here we go, guys. We're going to wrap this up real quick. I'm going to talk one real thing about Jacked Brunch. We're going to be in the San Francisco area this weekend. We're going to be in Sausalito. Sign up at jackedbrunch.com. Food, fun, fellowship. It is amazing what it feels like to get together with people that share your values, see the world a similar way, have the same media references, talk about the same things. It's really uplifting, and there's a lot of joy involved. So come on down, jackedbrunch.com. We will be in Denver on the weekend of the 5th, in LA and Seattle and DC again in 2022. jackedbrunch.com. Also, if you want to live the values that you know will shape and change the future of America, help men, help mankind. That's what we're all about. Liminal-order.com. Masculinity, brotherhood, and sovereignty. Come down, check that out. Do something to help yourself, help your family, help your community, and help the nation. And hit subscribe, share this, all those things. Please subscribe on whatever podcast app you're listening. Share this YouTube or Rumble video or Twitter Periscope video. All the things. Just help get the word out. Appreciate it, guys. And with that, we are out. On this show, we're driven by curiosity. We want to chart a path forward. Best people, best conversations. We're on a journey and it's just getting started.